Throughout history, free thinkers have outraged the religious with their wacky ideas about the virtues of free speech, reason, and of course, eating babies. Now, God is dying, and it's time to dispose of his remains. From the pits of hell, Satan sends two puppets of the imperialist West and the Zionist Jews against God, Islam, and tiny kittens to bring you their propaganda and conspire for a new world order. This is Secular Jihadist for a Muslim Enlightenment with Ali Rizvi and Armin Navabi.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Secular Jihadist for a Muslim Enlightenment. My name is Ali Rizvi, and with me is not Armin Navabi this week because, as I mentioned in a previous episode, for the month of August and a little bit of September, Armin and I are separated. Armin is in Europe. He's touring there, and I'm here in North America. So we've got a bit of a time zone difference. So we are doing stuff together, but at the same time, we also are doing some independent interviews. You may have seen or heard Armin's interview with Ali Dawa, the Islamic preacher, popular YouTube Islamic preacher in the UK at Speaker's Corner. If you haven't, that's amazing. So make sure you listen to that. And today, I'm actually doing a solo conversation with someone who's been here previously. And when he was here previously, things were different, and now things are different, and they've they've kind of moved forward. So my good friend Leon Korteweg is on the show. Am I pronouncing that right, Leon?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So what's the right pronunciation?
Well, we would say Leon Korteweg, but I don't really mind the pronunciation all that too much. I don't.
Okay, that's good. Leon, if you haven't heard the previous episode that he was on, so Leon he's from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam, or he lives in Amsterdam.
Well,
and
not really.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No, no. We met in Amsterdam, and we're going to meet each other again in Amsterdam this month.
Yes.
But I actually live in a small village between Nijmegen and Arnhem in the east. So.
Okay, yes. Okay. I got it wrong. We're us North Americans.
You're not the first and probably not the last to get it wrong.
Yeah, geography's terrible. But so Leon comes from he's a former white nationalist. Yeah. And his story in detail is in the previous episode that we did with you, Leon, and you actually told it in a very, very compelling, and it was pretty jaw-dropping the way that you explained it at that point. So I would recommend that people who are listening to this also check out the previous episode where we talked about this. And it was some time ago. Obviously, white nationalism now and white supremacy is much more prominent in the headlines and in the news nowadays around the world, everywhere. So that's why I thought it was really, really important to have you back on and check in with you, because a lot of things that you talked about in the previous episode, it's kind of chilling how many of those things are sort of coming to light now and really rising up. So to start with, can you just tell the audience just a quick review for those who haven't heard the previous episode, just your background and your association with white nationalism and how you got out of it?
Yes, so there were two main factors that led me to radicalize into a far-right direction. The first one was that I was faced with lots of questions when the film director Theo van Gogh, or Theo van Gogh as you pronounce him, was assassinated on I think it was the 2nd of November in 2004, just after he released a short film together with Ayaan Hirsi Ali called Submission, and it was about the treatment, or rather mistreatment, of women within Islam and with Quranic justifications for it. And this very controversial film evoked so much hostility from radical Muslims in the Netherlands that one of them actually assassinated Theo van Gogh in broad daylight in Amsterdam. Now, this was a big shock for our entire country, basically, and lots of us were searching for answers, like how do we deal with this? what should be our response to this act of terrorism.
And this was Islamic terrorism. I mean, he
This
was
was
killed
Islamic
by
terrorism. Yes.
by a jihadist. Yeah.
Yes. We didn't call him a jihadist at the time. The term was not very common at the time. Like jihadi was very much a term in the context of Pakistan. We call him a Muslim extremist. Fortunately, nowadays we have better terms for that, like Islamist or jihadist. I think those are better. But yes, he was a radicalized Muslim from a Moroccan background. Mohammed Bouyeri was his name. And he thought that Theo van Gogh, together with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, had offended Islam so much that he needed to be killed, and she as well. He also, the assassin also left a note, a 5-letter note, on a stick, and he stuck that knife into Theo van Gogh's body. So that is pretty gruesome.
So it was left out in public. I mean, there are, unfortunately, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this, but there are photos of it online when they found the body and they had the knife through his chest and the note stuck to it.
Yeah. So this was a pretty horrifying experience for most of the country, I would say. And
sorry, can you say what was on the note?
It was in Dutch. Badly written, several quotes from the Quran. It was about a long declaration of war to the West, basically the imperialist West, and that the West are infidels and they're trying to offend and attack and destroy Islam. And he was saying things like, I know that you, just like Salman Rushdie, you, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you kafir, you murtad, you will certainly perish, you will certainly be defeated.
Murtad means apostate or...
Yes. Also, one thing that I did not know, but this is probably quite significant. Her name was misspelled as Hirsi instead of Hirsi. And I read afterwards a commentary by Christopher Hitchens saying that this is probably trying to make her sound Jewish, because Hirsi is a Jewish name, a Hebrew name. And maybe because of that note, lots of people in the Netherlands also still mispronounce her name as Ayaan Hirsi Ali instead of Hirsi. So I don't know how much influence that note has had, but this is probably an attempt by him to cast her as part of some Zionist conspiracy or whatever.
Right.
But that's all details. It was clear that this was a major cultural clash, and I was looking for a response, and I would eventually find that in ethnic nationalism. Basically, the idea that cultures should be radically separated, cultures as well as people. Like, people belong to certain cultures, and the cultures should not mix in order to to safeguard the harmony in society. That was my eventual answer to this question. And I was eventually led to that conclusion because of another factor, because I didn't have many friends in school in that particular school year. I did have in the previous year, but almost all my friends left for a different school, just a coincidence. And one of my good friends no longer considered me a friend at the end of the school year, and I still don't know why. But and then we also mixed classes, so I came in a different class and I had no friends there, and it was really difficult for me to make friends. And so I sought them somewhere else because I didn't want to be alone. And now a neighborhood friend of mine had formed this neo-Nazi skinhead group, and I decided to join that because I would rather have bad friends than no friends at all. So that's basically, and they provided me an answer to the questions I was having after the murder of Theo van Gogh.
So there was the murder of Theo van Gogh did affect you, and you did look at that, and so there was already an ideological element that was within you that was reactionary to this event, but at the
Yes.
same time, there was a confluence with this whole idea of social isolation, that you didn't have friends, and you were looking for a group. So both of those factors played a part, you'd say?
Yes. I think it's very important to consider both, because I could have radicalized in a different fashion if I was influenced by different people, socially influenced by different people. You see this a lot with radicalization. These times, at least in the West, there are three main types of radicalization. One is the far right, the other is the far left, and the third is Islamism or jihadism. These are the main three radicalisms in the West at the moment. So it could have gone either of these three ways, and I happened to come into contact with the far right basically, but it could have gone differently. I myself was raised in a leftist home, so it could have gone differently. Maybe if I had Muslim friends, I would have converted to Islam. I don't know. There's lots of things that can happen, and actually the processes of radicalization are quite similar, and the social environment in which you are mostly the determining factor in deciding which way you are radicalizing, which of these three directions.
Mm-hmm.
So it could have gone differently. It's somewhat of it is a coincidence. I was not very prone to radicalize in a far right direction before then, really. Even though I had already questions about multicultural society ever since 9/11 and ever since the assassination of Pim Fortuyn the next year. Mm. So there were already questions in my mind, but I didn't have a clear answer to it. But from the far right, from the people that I socialized with, I got a very clear, simple answer. Separate all the cultures, all foreigners out. They can have their own countries, but not here. And that this would be a solution to an evident problem. But of course, it was way too generalized, and it's not a real solution to a very complicated problem. Actually, multiple problems.
Yeah. Is it? You said you were raised in a sort of a very leftist kind of liberal environment with your family.
Yes.
Were they aware of? I mean, you joined your sort of a neo-Nazi skinhead group, started by your neighbors, and were they aware of this? Did you look the part? How did they react? Or did they
know? I tried to hide it because I knew that they would not approve of it. There were some times when I gave out, I sent signals, for example, during dinner. Like we always had dinner together with the family, and that's when everybody talked about their day. And we also found it very important to talk about world politics, politics in general, and things in society, social issues. We found it very important to discuss these things, what's on our minds, at dinner. And I would sometimes say some very radical conservative things about foreigners and immigrants when the topic came up. And sometimes my parents were shocked, like, where did you get this kind of opinion from? And I would say, well, that is my opinion because of this and because of this. And but I did not reveal that I was actually part of this skinhead neo-Nazi group. You know, the group started out as a bit of a joke, but it became more serious over time. So in the beginning, it was just playing cool, playing tough. In part because I think many in that group were probably really scared of foreigners, really scared of immigrants. Muslims, like we equated immigrants and Muslims as if all Muslims are immigrants and as all immigrants are Muslims, like very generalized attitude. Mm-hmm. I think many of them were scared and bonded together to find some strength in community. So yeah,
Yeah,
but I try to keep my membership from this group hidden from my family until they eventually found out.
yeah. So I mean, I think what you're saying about all Muslims and immigrants and that conflation what's really interesting about that is that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was kind of triggered your whole sort of joining this neo-Nazi group. I mean, she was also an immigrant, right? And she was a Somali, a black immigrant.
Yes.
So how did you sort of rationalize that, or did you sort of feel like, okay, well, she's the good one who's on our side, or something like that? What
Well,
was the thought
that's a very
process?
good question. I wish I could still go back to my thoughts and memories of those years, because um, in hindsight, she should have been my strongest ally. But I was very conflicted about her because on the one hand, yes, she was critical of Islam, but on the other hand, and that's when it happened in 2006, it
Right.
came out that she had used false identity and false pretexts to get asylum in the Netherlands because she was fleeing from an arranged marriage, which would have taken place in Germany, but she crossed the border into the Netherlands to seek asylum. So that's and she lied about her real name in order to avoid being tracked down by her relatives. So now, in hindsight, now I can understand it's a very defendable choice if your life is at stake. If
Yeah, it's actually quite common. I mean, for people who are escaping, especially people ex-Muslims like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who are escaping sort of this patriarchal, just Islamic theocratic the pressure, that they have. It has very dire consequences, and you're running for your life. So you'll often do whatever it takes to get out of it.
Yes, and I should have been more empathetic at the time, but I followed the conservative nationalist opinion at the time, which was saying, well, she lied when she immigrated to the Netherlands. Therefore, her application should be overturned and she should be, basically kicked out of the country.
Yeah.
And I had no proper appreciation of the special circumstances in which she came to the Netherlands. And I followed the immigration minister Rita Verdonk's arguments at the time. She said, well, we can't make an exception for Ayaan, even though she was a member of her own party.
Yeah.
But because if you make an exception for Ayaan, then everyone wants to be an exception, and everyone is a special case, and then we cannot reject anyone's asylum application anymore. So I followed that argument. I'm ashamed of it now, really ashamed. But fortunately, I was not the decision maker at the time myself. But yes,
well,
she should have been our strongest ally at the time.
Yeah, the fact that I don't think you have right now the way that you're going about things. I don't think you should really think about being ashamed because you're coming out, you're providing insights into these thought processes and the factors that lead to people going in these directions. And I actually from you, I learned not only why people get radicalized in terms of neo-Nazis and white nationalists and white supremacists, but also the similar kind of process that leads to radicalization when it comes to Islamic jihad, or kids going around joining ISIS, or people becoming radicalized on the far left too. I mean, we've also seen that recently. So there's
it's very similar. I've learned a lot about radicalization in recent years, and that led me to reflect on my own experiences and those of others that I've read or come across. Like it's very similar actually, and it's not actually that much of a stretch when like people who are not born as Muslims, but they are in a particular condition. They see a shocking event happening in society, for example, a murder, assassination, or something else, terrorist attack, or something else that they find shocking. They're looking for an answer to that, and they may radicalize in a certain direction. But if I had been, well, just as I said before, if you happen to be friends with Muslims and you find their narratives about what happened to be plausible, you might be inclined to agree with them even more and actually convert to Islam. It's not uncommon for Dutch native-born people to convert to Islam. For various reasons, because they happen to be friends with Muslims and they find their narratives to be plausible. And this may happen for all the wrong reasons. And yes, I was influenced by my environment, and I found their narrative, their explanation, their response to the burning questions I had found to be plausible, and so I was attracted to that.
Yeah.
And I went along.
So I want to get into there's a lot we want to get into. First of all, we want to talk about how you sort of de-radicalized. You got out of this later on, and now my understanding is, and one of the things I admire about you is that you now consider like just nationalism in general to be a curse, somewhat like religion, right? In a way, or I'm paraphrasing like what I understand of your position, but the good thing that the thing I like about you is that you're very consistent. So you've been a very strong advocate of when you talk about how religion and nationalism are sort of these tribal things that are best avoided. You don't make exceptions for Islam. So you've been a very strong supporter of the ex-Muslim movement. You're also Wikipedian. You've written a lot of like the Wikipedian articles and you about the ex-Muslim movement and other things. So I think that that's another reason I think you're a very valuable resource for people to understand how this works, because you are actually consistent, right? You're not holding things to different standards. So
at least
I
I'm
want to talk
trying.
about that. Yeah. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the recent sort of spate of white supremacist and white nationalist terrorism that has just exploded around the world, essentially. But before we get into that, what can you tell us? I think a lot of people listening to this are going to want to know that when you were in that sort of neo-Nazi group, what did they do? What were those meetings like? What went on in there? What are the kinds of things that they used to talk about or do?
Well, as I said before, it started out as a joke, a bit party-ish. And the first meeting was with lots of beer, and there was music. So there were like two styles of music were very popular that we listened to. One was, you could categorize it as RAC, Rock Against Communism. And it's basically Nazi rock music and punk. And it was in Dutch, in English, or in German. Those three languages were very, very popular. And they were glorifying the Nazi Germany and sometimes calling for a Fourth Reich or some white revolution. And so there's another a genre of music that was very popular, and that was related to what we call hardcore. Now, this is not the hardcore rock music, but this is...
I love hardcore rock music.
This is actually something electronic.
Yeah.
And it's how do I explain this? It has a very high BPM, like it's like 160, 180, 200 BPM, so it's very fast
like
music.
Yeah. Look at that, yeah.
Yeah, so, and this was very popular in the early 90s, especially in the city of Rotterdam, where this is supposedly born. Originally, this hardcore music did not have any nationalistic or far-right association, but for some reason these two merged at some point in the early 90s, and this culture developed around it. which was very nationalistic, very far right. It would you would see people who would also the skinheads came into it. Skinheads, as such, are not necessarily far right, but for some reason these were all combined into one thing. You see that people were starting to wear like a Dutch flag on their shoulders, their arms, on their clothes, and they were starting to wear certain black clothes and black boots with white laces in it, and white stood for white power. So there was lots of things coming together there, and when I joined this movement in 2005, lots of these elements were still there. So this music was very fast, and they would shout slogans in Dutch or English or German. Sometimes you would hear actual recordings of Hitler or Goebbels, or that they were mixed into this music, and this was really like glorifying it in music, the Third Reich, and and really expecting a new life. But this was the radical side. Not all people present at those meetings were that radical. Like, I was very cautious. I didn't want a Fourth Reich, but something like it, like something like an ethnically pure state was appealing to me at the time.
When you say that not all the skinheads were far right, what is a non-far right skinhead? Like, I mean, this is something that I think will be on a lot of people's minds when you said that.
Well, I don't have a lot of information about that, but there are groups of skinheads who have distanced themselves explicitly from Nazis. So there are websites at the time that we visited, like which said real skinheads are not Nazis. Like, so there have been efforts by skinheads to distance themselves from neo-Nazis, even though skinheads and neo-Nazis have become synonymous in popular thought.
But what do skinheads? What is it? So is this sort of similar to right now? There's the people are making a distinction, especially people on the far right, that white nationalism is not white supremacy. White nationalism, we just think that everybody should be segregated. It's not like blacks are better than whites or whites are better than blacks. It's just that blacks should stay where they are, and whites should be where we are. And so that's a white nationalist thing. It doesn't mean that we're supremacists. But to me, if you think that way, and if you think that segregation is, aren't you just you're white supremacist anyway? To have that view?
It's hard to separate the two. At the time, I would have thought of myself as an ethnic nationalist.
Right.
So I guess white nationalist, although I never used the term white nationalist but ethnic nationalist, I would call myself that. In my mind, all the time that I was within this movement, I had a constant struggle in my mind between trying to reason my position, and trying to follow the emotions that I felt were true. So I thought it was ridiculous, rationally, to consider any sort of race to be superior to any other race. But emotionally, I sometimes felt superior to non-white people. And I was sometimes afraid of the white race dying out for some reason. There are some irrational fears about this, that you really think, oh no, what if we no longer exist in the future? And at the time I didn't want to admit that, but I think it's important to explain that I did have those thoughts and did have those fears. And of course, you also frequently invoke history, like we are the ones who conquered the entire world. We had colonies and empires everywhere, and see where it has gotten us in the past few decades with our empires falling apart, these countries becoming independent, and lots of immigrants coming our way. Like it should have been different. It was better in a time of colonialism and imperialism. These are thoughts that you exchange between each other. You try to develop that, and sometimes there's this imperialist nostalgia that it does happen, even if rationally, at least I myself was telling myself like, no, colonialism and imperialism was wrong. It's good for these countries to be independent, even if, you know, their borders are still like arbitrarily drawn and they may not have properly developed yet. And we still have things to do. We still have certain responsibilities for our ex-colonies, but we should not restore imperialism. It's wrong. Certainly not restore slavery. I've never been an advocate of slavery, but these are two basic narratives that are competing in my mind. Like rationally, I wanted to be some sort of ethnic nationalist that saw all peoples as equals as long as they stayed in their own country. But emotionally, there were fears and thoughts and ideals that had something to do with thinking that yes, my ethnicity, my race, my people is superior to all others.
Yeah. So and this is what I'm trying to parse, because I don't want to. I know that there's and we've talked about it in the past with Armin as well, like this white supremacy versus white nationalism. So there's I mean, when you look at I'm hearing sort of two things that are happening here. You know, one is that this sort of imperial nostalgia, like, you know, the nostalgia for how, you know, we took over and, you know, the white race and how great it was and everything. And there's sort of some level of wanting to bring that back and genuinely feeling that, you know, white people are better than other people, or superior to other people. And then on the other hand, you just have this fear of white genocide, that white people are going to be replaced with the interbreeding, with all of our sort of white guilt and apologetics and everything like that. We're going to let all these immigrants in, they're going to take over, and then we're going to become a minority. And our entire legacy will go away. So is it possible to have that fear of being wiped out as a race without necessarily thinking that your race is better? Or does it kind of go hand in hand, as you said, that even if you sort of intellectually you're thinking that, okay, I just don't want my race to disappear, but emotionally the reason that you don't want, the reason that it's such a scary thought is because you do think that, you know, your race is better or has a better legacy than everybody else. So is there a difference, or do they kind of go hand in hand? Or
I think that's an extremely well phrased question, and I think they go hand in hand. It's almost impossible to separate them, because if ethnicities and races and peoples were truly equal, why do you fear mixing them? Why should your particular one be defended at all costs and remain perpetually extant? I don't see the point if there's nothing wrong with other people existing, and even mixing should not be an issue if you truly have no idea about them being worse than you. If you don't think they're worse than you, what's the problem with them mixing, intermingling with you?
Yeah, just because they look different, right? I like a lot of times they may have the same kinds of ideas, and you know, they like I think of the example of someone like Mike Pence, who's the vice president of the U.S., right? And he is a guy who will never have alcohol alone with a woman and all these things that he says, which sounds like what they used to say in Saudi Arabia when I was growing up. And he has a lot of the same views, you know, gay conversion therapy and all this crap. And then on the other hand, you have somebody like Majid Nawaz, who's a brown Muslim, who is just, you know, he's a summation of Enlightenment values, right? In a way. So, to me, I would think that if you had a choice between those two, and you are pro Enlightenment values, and you're pro liberalism, and you're pro open societies, whatever you would consider the Western, quote unquote, Western legacy, then Majid Nawaz would be your choice over someone like Mike Pence. It's not
Absolutely.
a matter of and if you have people like that coming in, or I think that makes I don't see any issue with that
Yes,
fear. So
exactly. And that's, I see by far most ex-Muslims and liberal Muslims, um, like Majid Nawaz, they embrace those Enlightenment values, and that's exactly what we need, exactly to bring society, to bring civilization forward. But at the time when I was a white nationalist, I didn't understand what Enlightenment stood for. I was very conservative minded as well. I wasn't a liberal, even though I was thinking in terms of Western freedoms and rights. Um, that all those immigrants don't know. They should be defended against these immigrants which will not respect human rights, women's rights, gay rights, which is also particularly interesting, probably discussed as last time as well. LGBT emancipation in the Netherlands has progressed so far to the point where we regard LGBT emancipation as part of our national identity. This is a really recent development, but it's used by right-wing, especially far-right and radical right, alt-right groups and political parties to mean that Dutch culture means that we are nice to gay people. So if you're not nice to gay people, you don't belong in this country. So this is another way of trying to limit immigration of Muslims mainly, but
that's
also other people who do not
yeah.
Accept gays in the same way we do. So it's actually, even though emancipation, LGBT emancipation should be something inclusive, the right wing, especially the far right, will use this as a weapon to exclude others.
Right.
And even though you can be critical of the homophobic aspects of Islam, you should be.
Absolutely.
This is not a reason to reject any immigrants at the border. This is a different question, a separate issue. So yeah.
Yeah. So that's that's interesting. We did have a recent episode with Jimmy Bungash on this, like this whole idea that when you have especially liberals, it's a conundrum for them that when they are faced with just these rabid levels of Islamic homophobia, then they don't know what to do, because they don't want to give an inch on as Armin said, they don't want to give an inch on homophobia and on gay rights, right? Whereas a lot of these Muslim communities, they don't want to give an inch on accepting homosexuality as something or normalizing it. So they have to choose between being seen as Islamophobic versus being seen as homophobic, and that's a really, really tough conundrum. And I think that's a really great front to illustrate, what the issue is when it comes to a lot of the leftist and liberal hypocrisy when it comes to Islam and some of the misogyny and homophobia that you see within Muslim communities. But anyway, that's a separate topic.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get, so now what you're seeing is a lot of the things that you went through, with your sort of foray into white nationalism and white supremacy, you got out of it, right?
Yes.
And you eventually decided that all of this was a farce, and now you talk about it. So what is it that got you out of it?
Well, this is one of the most complicated questions that you can ask me. It's
That's what we do.
Yes. So it's lots of different factors. Even though I can pinpoint the two factors that mainly led me into it, there's lots of different factors that led me out of it. I think so. I wanted to dissociate myself from the real neo-Nazis. I never considered myself a Nazi, but I called myself an ethnic nationalist. They're very close to each other, to be honest. But at least I didn't want to call myself a Nazi or National Socialist. Or a fascist, because those are dirty words. So, and also I didn't, I always thought that the Holocaust was bad, even though for a time I denied it was that big of a deal, or there were fewer than 6 million, but I eventually had to accept that that was the historical reality, and I should reject it.
So you thought that, but your denial of the Holocaust wasn't that it didn't happen, but that it just wasn't as bad as they made it out to be?
Yes, that wasn't not as bad as the historical consensus, but for a very, very brief time I did this revisionist
history thing, yeah.
And I am very ashamed of it, but fortunately I was quickly came to my senses. Okay, just accept the consensus. Yes, there were 6 million Jews, and anyway, different topic. But I wanted to distance myself from the real neo-Nazis, and I was striving to form a moderate nationalism, as I called it myself. Moderate nationalism. I'm a moderate nationalist, so I'm not bad. Like that's what I said to people. On the other hand, I also because I was challenged by my leftist liberal family, friends, and neighbors, and in school, people came up to me lots of times and said, "Oh, so you hate all foreigners?" I was like, no, I'm not a racist. I just think that we should better separate cultures, and people who integrate well into society are allowed to stay. And that's also one point. I think that was in 2007 when we had a civics class in my grammar school, and something in the textbook said that we discussed concepts like foreigners and native born people, and what is a nation, and so the text was suggesting that foreigners and immigrants can become part of the nation. And I asked my teacher, is this true? Can foreigners be part of the nation, or only people with certain ethnic biological features, like who are descendants of the same ethnic group? Are those only the nation, or can a nation also include immigrants if they properly integrate and assimilate? And she said, yes, if immigrants integrate well enough in society, if they assimilate, assimilate is still a dirty word, but integrate enough, if they follow the rules, if they adopt the language, then they can become part of the nation. And that changed my mind a lot. That was the first major step in my thinking. Okay, so not all foreigners need to be kicked out. Okay, that's an entirely different solution to the question about multiculturalism and what to do with the clash between liberal Enlightenment values on the one hand and Muslim fundamentalism on the other. So I would not articulate that in those terms, but in hindsight you can see it like that. So then 2 years later I would go study history in a different city. Meanwhile, I had already reduced my contact with the neo-Nazi group because I no longer agreed with them, and because I was able to make friends in my own school. After a few months of real isolation in my school, I was finally able to make friends. One of them is still my best friend. So, and that really helped because I didn't need bad friends to no longer be alone. So and I was less and less influenced by the neo-Nazi group. I no longer needed them. I found it too radical. I was worried that I would get into some bad situations. We can talk about them later. And studying in a different city also meant further distancing myself from that neo-Nazi group. And the city that I went to is Nijmegen, which is probably the most left-wing city in the entire country. And I was warned for that. Like, you can study history in several cities in the Netherlands. My other choices were Groningen and Amsterdam and Leiden. Well, I didn't want to go to Amsterdam because I found it a way too big city for me. I found that very scary.
Yeah. I really like Groningen. Like I went there for when I did my tour. Went to Rotterdam and Amsterdam and then Groningen and then also some places in Belgium. But yeah, yeah, the Groningen was like that's a university town, right?
Yes.
I haven't seen so many bicycles in my life in one place. Like it was just like a big bicycle orgy. It was crazy.
Oh
Yeah.
yes. The Netherlands has most bicycles per capita, I think. We're the bike country of the world.
Yeah, we should have a separate episode about that.
The first thing that foreigners who come and live in our country should do is buy a bike. That's even more important than learning the language.
I know.
But I did not decided not to go to study in Groningen because the focus on the history course there was on non-Western history, and I wanted to study Western history because I was very interested in our origins, like where the Europeans, the Dutch people come from. And Leiden, I found it too far away from my native town. I wanted to visit my parents and my friends in my native town often. So even though Leiden was known as a right-wing university, this is the university where Paul Cliteur, for example, is lectures a lot. Paul Cliteur is very controversial figure in Dutch politics right now. He is the Senate leader for the Forum for Democracy, which is our alt-right party, basically. He's an atheist, but he supports a party which is increasingly identifying with Christianity at the moment.
That's actually that's happening quite a bit. I mean, there's a lot of the sort of atheist community since the last few years. Many of them are rediscovering Christianity as a part of their heritage and identity. More of a than really the religious aspect. But I always think that's entertaining. It's one of I know it's definitely a pet peeve for Armin. But yeah,
yes. It's also one of mine.
I find it comical. It's funny.
Yes, even the leader of this party, Thierry Baudet, who is the most controversial politician in our country at the moment. He says that he's an atheist, but that atheism is a kind of Christianity. If you're an atheist, then you're kind of Christian because Christians invented atheism for some reason. Because the first atheists during the Age of Enlightenment were originally Christian, were ex-Christians. So if you're an atheist, you're kind of a Christian for some reason.
I know that they wouldn't take the whole cultural appropriation argument seriously, but really, like, claiming Christianity as a Western thing, and I know that it went to Rome, and I know what happened after all of that, but Jesus really probably looked a lot more like me than you.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a Middle Eastern hippie, right? Yes. Who grew up in the desert. So it's just that's something that I just think there's a lot of comedy fodder there. But again, we can get into that later. But go ahead.
Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion, just like Islam and Judaism are. So it's just taken better root in the West.
It did,
or worse root.
I know.
But yes, but I at the time I myself had these issues of identity. I once asked my parents, who were left-wing, while I was a nationalist myself, I openly asked them, like, should we as nationalists ally ourselves with, or as atheist nationalists, ally ourselves with the Christians to form one bloc against the Muslims? I said that really, literally. And even though my parents were like liberal Christians at that point, they said, no, that's a bad reason. Don't do that.
So you come out of this, and you're actually a lot of that has to do with going to university, studying history, being surrounded by friends and or mentors, maybe even a sort of a connection back with your liberal parents and your leftist parents,
Yes.
Who I would figure may have been sort of happy that you're coming out of it and you're kind of thinking your way out of this.
They're very happy about it, that I made a 180 turn about this, about all these issues, my political orientation, basically.
Yeah.
At the time I was very rebellious against my parents during my nationalist period. Like, this was completely not how they raised me. My mother was very afraid that I would do bad things. She was very afraid of the far right for good reasons. But my father, he studied psychology, and he knew a bit about pedagogy. So because he's a teacher in those subjects also. So he thought, okay, we need to be careful about this. Give Leon his space to think about things, and to challenge his beliefs, but gradually, and in a way that we still do accept him as our son, and then have an open conversation, and sometimes engage with his points, then slowly try to change his mind, and they did that fairly well. So my parents were also an influence in de-radicalizing me, but I think the environment in which I studied was the most important one. There were several things going on, as I said already, moderated due to the idea of inclusive nation building, with foreigners, if they adapt enough, if they integrate enough, they can be part of the nation. But I was really challenged about the whole concept, the notion of a nation, the nation notion.
Mm-hmm. The nation notion.
Yes. Yeah. when I studied history, because at the end of the first year there, so that would be in early 2010, we were dealing with early modern history and modern history, and that also treated the subject of nationalism, so 18th century, 19th century, and there I discovered that nationalism seems to emerge out of nowhere from history, even though you've always had the feeling of patriotism, perhaps. That you feel a certain loyalty and belonging to your country, but the concept of the nation was very new. It was recently invented, actually. It imagined a certain community to exist, even though previous generations never thought of themselves as member of this national community. You had regional communities with different dialects, and the province or the duchy or the kingdom next door may have the same language, but you would still treat them as different people. Or your neighbors, or the next town, the next door, the next province may have a different language, but you are ruled by the same king, so you still consider them the same people, even if you can't talk to them. The 18th and 19th century changed all that. The focus of the community became the nation, and language became the most important element of the nation. This is not true for all of Europe, but in most of Europe. Like, for example, in Yugoslavia, religion was more important for forming the nation than language was. All of Yugoslavia, except for Slovenia and Macedonia and a little portion in Kosovo where they speak Albanian. All of them spoke kind of the same dialects, but they were divided by Catholicism, Islam, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, it's kind of like that with Pakistan as well. I mean, it comes together. It is a nation state, but it kind of, the languages, the provincial languages, are really not the uniting factor. The uniting factor is that they're all Muslims. You know, it's kind of similar to that. Yeah.
Because the Pashto and the Baluchis are Eastern Iranian languages,
right?
While Sindh and Punjabi and Urdu, which is the national language, are all Indo-Aryan languages.
Yeah.
So it's a different branch of the same language family, but it's very different and it's hard to understand each other.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting. Is when you talk about nationalism being sort of a recent thing, is it? Could it be just a matter of scale, in the sense that, because I know Yuval Noah Harari has talked about this. He said that, you know, there was initially people had tribes, and tribes were united by, you know, certain common elements. Could be language, could be some sort of belief, or whatever it was. But it just became a scale that people became more interconnected. A lot of that is because of, you know, language and the unique human ability to communicate and craft language in order to be able to connect with people, and then the scale becomes bigger. But I think the thing that is different is that in a tribe you personally knew everybody, so you had a personal connection with everyone, so you had a natural sense of protection, natural sense of belonging and ownership with that tribe. In a nation, it's the same dynamic at a larger scale. The only thing is you don't know the vast majority of people who you are willing to die for if someone attacks the country.
That's a strange thing.
Yeah, that is a really that I think, I mean, more than the tribalistic element of nationalism, I think that part of it is probably the innovation.
Yes, I would say that, and you know, in terms of demographic or geographic scale, it's not necessarily greater, because we used to have like multi-ethnic states such as Austria-Hungary. And they split due to nationalism, because these peoples also all spoke different languages, and therefore they conceived themselves as different nations, and they wanted independence. Now that wasn't necessary, because they already had the same king, same emperor for centuries, at least most parts of Austria-Hungary. But language was the main divider. So they conceived themselves as a nation because of language. And that actually made the country smaller. We got all these small countries now in Central and Eastern Europe, which used to be one empire, but became smaller because they didn't consider themselves as a unit. Right. So, but for most of Western Europe, I would say that is true. That we used to have lots of small provinces with dukes and counts and what have you, and bishops, but it all became one Dutch kingdom eventually, and language was the most important binding element of this nation. My nationalism was very language based, and but it's less exclusive than, for example, racism, which is nowadays very much based on skin. It used to be broader than that, but nowadays it's very much based on physical appearance. And language does not base itself on physical appearance. You can learn a language, even if you're not, you haven't learned it as your mother tongue. You can still learn it when you're an immigrant. So in that sense, it's not exclusive, and it can be inclusive. So it's and I still think, even now as an internationalist, I still think it's important that if you move to a different country, that you learn the lingua franca there, or the official language, or whatever is important for you to go about your day. That still is an important thing. But to consider a certain linguistic group a nation, that's a different issue. Then
Yes.
you frame it as an imagined community, because it's not a real community. You don't know these people. It's not a face-to-face tribal society. That's true.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
the
So
innovation that nationalism brought.
yeah. So let's move on to now. What's been happening since we
Yeah.
last talked. Okay. So since we last talked, I mean, there's been, so even before we last talked, around there was a lot of, anytime you heard of something happening, like someone drove a car into a group of people, someone threw a bomb somewhere else, or whatever it was, there was an explosion, there was a shooting, like in Paris, France. It was always ISIS. I had
Almost always.
yeah, my Muslim family, my Muslim friends would just sit there and they'd be like, "Oh my God, it's gonna be another Muslim, isn't it? It's gonna be a Muslim attack," and they used to worry about it. Today, whenever we read news stories like that, everyone almost it just assumes that it's going to be some sort of white supremacist, white nationalist kind of attack, or some kind of far right attack. So there's been a spate of these. I mean, in over here in Canada, what was amazing is the Quebec City shooting. Right, there's a man who was a big fan of Marine Le Pen and sort of radicalized, sort of far right kind of guy. Went into a Quebec City mosque and he shot and he killed 6 people, 6 Muslims there, and that's more people in that kind of attack that has ever been killed than have ever been killed by Islamic terrorism in the entire history of Canada. Right?
Wow.
So, yeah, in Canada it's very different. There's not Islamic terrorism has never really been. There have been plots. There have been really really dangerous things like the Toronto 18 case from the 2000s. Where there were sort of 18 people getting together and they were doing they were planning a big bombing that was busted open by Canadian intelligence. And
Good.
programming note, we do have a previous episode with Mubin Sheikh. He was the undercover CSIS agent, the Canadian intelligence agent who went in and he helped bust that group open and expose and foil that plot. But in any case, I try not to go on tangents over here. But so there was the Quebec City thing, then there it was the Finsbury Mosque issue in London. So these things are kind of bubbling up. But now, Christchurch, like the guy made a video that was like, it was like he was playing a video game. And he went out and he killed loads of people. He killed like dozens of people in Christchurch, in the Christchurch Mosque. He left a manifesto. Recently in El Paso, the shooter went in North America. It was against Hispanic people and Latinos and Latinas or Latinx. I don't know what the terminology is nowadays, but yeah, that it's so he went in and he did that and he killed a large number of people. We also had a Dayton, Ohio shooting in the U.S. Another sort of shooting that came from it came from a left-wing guy, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But you've had many of these attacks, and I'm not listing all of them. There was a shooter in Norway recently, who was fortunately stopped before he could do a lot of damage. These things are happening. They're almost always overwhelmingly, white men, right? And not to mention all of the school shootings that are happening in the U.S., like all of the gun violence, and they're sort of, and they also happen to be white men. I mean, they don't necessarily say that they're white nationalists or white supremacists. Many of them probably aren't, but they feel. And then people talk about like mental health disorders. They talk about bullying, and I always wonder that if it is about bullying, and if it's about being marginalized, you would see so many more LGBT people, more women, more trans people, more people in minorities coming up and doing it. I mean, the people who are actually bullied and who are on the receiving end of things, like they're the ones who would go out and do it. But these are almost always white men. And so is it really about bullying or is it about entitlement? Another thing in here that's sort of related is in Toronto, there was a guy, last year who went out and he killed 10 people with a van in Toronto, right? In this city, and he turned out to be an incel, right? Like the there was another guy who went and he killed a whole bunch of women, I think, at a university. Elliot, I can't remember his name, is the sort of the head of the incels. And incels are these involuntary celibates, right? Who are I guess they're just not, they feel like they're entitled to sex and women and they can't get it, so they go out and they kill people, the normies, the normal people, for it. And there are parallels between these incels and a lot of these white nationalists and white supremacists, and the incels also happen to be largely, overwhelmingly white men. All of these things. First of all, do you think all of these different things are related? Is there a sense of entitlement? Why is the white man thing a common denominator?
That's a very good but also difficult question. I think yes, they are related. Maybe not ideologically, but there are certain socioeconomic factors that all stimulate, especially white men in the West to conduct such terrorist attacks. But I should emphasize that it's not just white men. Also, when it's from foreigners, especially Islamists, jihadists, then it's also usually men and rarely women. We have few cases of suicide, female suicide bombers, but they're very rare in comparison. So I think that it does have a lot to do with a sense of entitlement, with the idea that as a man you're entitled to have certain things, and if you don't get them, then you are in your right to take revenge on society, which should have provided you with these things. This is a very good description of the incel phenomenon. But also in various other cases when you have been bullied in your school or other things in your life that didn't go the way you wanted it, that you feel like society owed you something and you should get it back. Or if you don't take action, then society is going the wrong direction, and you need to make a statement. That would be particularly relevant to those who kill certain people because they're foreigners, or because they're black, or because they're leftists, and they're trying to, in your opinion, trying to erase your identity and traditions and culture. Or for example, those who commit violence against abortion clinics or doctors, that they're trying to steer your country away from the values that it should hold, that everyone should obey and comply to. And it's interesting that it's not women who are trying to commit violence against abortion clinics. It's men who think that they get to tell others that women should always give birth, which is really strange because it's not about their own bodies.
Forced birth, yeah.
Yes, and so there is a I think entitlement is the best way to capture all of it. It may also be frustration with your expectations being spoiled, and I think in general, as a society, we still tend to teach boys more than girls that they should fight for their rights, and teach girls more that they should comply with whatever the community wishes they should do. And so this is part of the reason why men tend to be more prone to act violently, to take justice basically in their own hands, and to act in terrorist ways to make their point, or to get their way, or to signal others to follow their example. Yes, I think that's the common. Those are the common elements between all these acts.
I think it's Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so many questions buzzing around my mind, but uh, you know what? One of the things, because you talked about how, society teaches that, I am wondering if there is anything biological in it too. Because I remember some time ago when that Google memo came out, James Damore, and he was talking about the differences between men and women, and
Yes.
how they might be suited to certain careers and not, and he used a lot of like sort of scientific studies to show it. But there are bigger scientific differences or bigger biological differences um, between men and women that actually that crowd who likes to tout this, they don't really discuss as much. For instance, um, just the being prone to violence. For instance, having higher rates of incarceration. Virtually 99% of all mass shootings, mass violence, mass killings are done by men. Child molestation. Child molestation is a really interesting one to me because I have, I mean, it's weird that men would often take kids just for sexual gratification, no other purpose, and they would do with them as they please, and then they take these children, they just discard them afterwards. You almost never hear of women doing that. You hear of women being complicit in it for money or because they were really, really brainwashed by men, but they you never really hear of women doing that. It's almost exclusively child molestation
Yes.
is a
There are
male
a few
phenomenon.
examples of nuns in Roman Catholic institutions who also have been found guilty in child molestation, but I think that has more to do with celibacy than anything else.
Yeah, yeah.
They're sexually frustrated. Um, but yes,
But
very very clear, overwhelming majority of male perpetrators in
mm.
this case.
and
Yes.
I remember when we were studying well, when I was in university, when I was in medical school, and we're studying, karyotypes and cytogenetics, we saw there was, I mean, you know how you have you have XX is biological female, and then XY is biological male, and then you have XO, which is Turner syndrome. You have XXY, which is Klinefelter's, but then you also had XYY, and these are people who had extra Y chromosomes,
Okay.
and they were associated with a very severe sort of antisocial, oppositional, defiant characteristics during adolescence, increased susceptibility to violence, much higher rates of incarceration. There are also other cases of XYYY, and it
Oh.
almost seemed like the more Y chromosomes you add, the more sort of unruly these people became. And there was a little bit of a revisionist kind of thing with sociologists in the 90s who tried to say, well, no, it's not because of the extra chromosome. It's because, they are treated differently when they are adolescents. And because of that, because they're bullied, they become more aggressive. So it really is a social phenomenon. But then again, why are they bullied or treated differently? There is something happening in their behavior. So there is, I think people are afraid to kind of open up these things. But I think that this idea about men, and this is, I'm obviously I'm a man myself. I'm very happy
Hmm.
I'm a man. I right now, obviously nowadays I wouldn't have it any other way. But I think that there is a lot of denial. People talk about how there's a denial about biology, and men and women are different, and men are better at certain things, and women are, well, more prone to certain career choices or whatever. I think people do, but the same people who like really touting these things tend to be in grave denial when you talk about this, like just obvious inconvenient truth about men just being overwhelmingly disproportionately prone to violence in a way,
Hmm.
and disproportionately compared to all of the other differences that they talk about. So I agree with you. I think there's a male aspect to it. It's just a sort of a traditional thing of who has had the power. So I am down with that. To what extent do you think, and this is a question for you,
Hmm.
is this a lot of what we're seeing, the sort of the rise of the far right, the rise of jihadism, right? Because jihadism and Islamic fundamentalism is also mainly perpetrated by men, right? Those
Hmm.
are overtly and just ostentatiously male-dominated patriarchal societies, right? In the
Yes.
Islamic world.
They often don't even allow women to fight, so a woman can't even be a jihadi.
They can't. So there's to what extent are these? When we had Steven Pinker on the show, we talked about this being whether it's a backlash more than a movement. So all of the sort of traditional elements of power, whether it's masculinity, whether it's Islam, and people who in the Islamic world, people had control over their youths, and you just sent me a video of Bilal Phillips, talking about lamenting how young Muslims are leaving Islam. Saudi Arabia is concerned about the same thing. They labeled atheism terrorism in 2014. Iran is talking about the tsunami of atheists coming up. Egypt is kicking atheists off the air. And we just, by the way, the guy they kicked off the air, Mohammed Hasham, he's in our last episode. We interviewed with him. There is a big fear in the Islamic world that they're losing their youth through the internet to the West, right? They're becoming more westernized, they're becoming more secular, they're being exposed to different ideas, and they're leaving the religion. So that makes the sort of old entrenched system try to hold on to it a little bit more. And when you're holding on to something that is about to die, you're going to scream really loud. You're going to be very loud. You may be a minority, but you will organize more. You will make a lot of noise, whereas the rest of the people just kind of moving on, they'll be quieter. So they may not be as apparent, even though the silent majority thing. It seems like the same kind of thing is happening with this sort of traditional white dominance in the West, right? With conservatives and especially white men trying to hold on to something because they know that the youth is becoming more and more progressive. People are moving towards another world. So all of this stuff, the rise of this far right authoritarian populism, and by that I don't just include white nationalism. I include the Islamic world. I mean, there's a whole world outside the Western world, right? So in the Islamic world, it's the exact same thing that's happening, and the violence is increasingly becoming a part of it. And now, just the violence is the same. They're white supremacists driving trucks into crowds. There are, just like Islamic jihadists did the same thing, and they're even using the same kind of methods. Do you think this is a movement, or do you think it's a backlash?
Well, I think it could be both. Although I would say that in the case of white nationalist terrorism and supremacism, it's more diverse, it's more fragmented. Although I should say that also jihadism is very fragmented along sectarian lines, with different groups clashing with each other constantly. For example, Islamic State is separated from Al Qaeda, so there's also a fragmentation. And they fought with Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. So these jihadist groups are also fighting amongst themselves. So maybe we just have a more commonly accepted term for an ideology that's just as fragmented as white nationalism, supremacism, the alt-right, whatever you want to call it. But I would certainly say that, yes, it's a backlash to a lot of developments that have been going on for several years and actually decades, and you can certainly call it all reactionary. And for religion, we call that fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, I would say, is basically the defense mechanism of a religion that is dying, that's being threatened in its existence. It thinks that the only way to save itself is go back to the source. What did the source text originally say? Because that is what the entire religion is founded on. The later traditions are less important. So you see that a lot of Islamists these days don't find the hadith that important, but they really double down on the Quran.
That's right.
And this is the same with Christian fundamentalism. They really find Genesis very important. They mark all the sayings of Jesus in red because that's that's the core of the faith. All the other sayings in the Bible are less important, and
They
they
disregard the
don't
Old
really
Testament.
consider later medieval theologians. For example, Thomas Aquinas is rarely quoted by any Christian fundamentalist. They are not important. It's about the text itself. So they really try to focus on what they consider the fundamentals of the religion, because those are in danger. They think this is the last stand of the religion should be made around the fundamentals, and that's where you get fundamentalism from. Now, I think that a mirror of that is happening in nationalism, in ethnic nationalism, supremacism, racism. That they're very afraid of the changing world around them, and certainly it also has to do a lot with a reaction to the rise of feminism. The women's liberation movement has been very successful in recent decades and has disempowered a lot of male dominance, masculine dominance in society. For example, you have all these laws coming now where you can no longer rape your wife. It's now illegal. It used to be legal all around the world before the 70s.
Yeah.
Now you can't even force your wife to have sex, which is a good thing for most of us, but some feel so disempowered that they can't even control their own wife anymore, and they long for periods in time when that wasn't the case, when they were still head of the family, and now they have to accept women as an equal partner, and they really don't really like that. They long for times when men were still in control, men were still in power, and so you see a very violent and vile reaction to that, and also this sense of entitlement, like, I am a man. I am entitled to have a wife of my own, and if I don't get it, I'll take revenge. And anything feminism related is bad. Feminism is cancer is now a very common slogan, and I think that only shows the success that the feminist movement has had in recent decades. That they've really been able to make women more equal, but some men still don't accept that development that has taken place. And the same is true for the Muslim world, where women are also slowly, gradually becoming emancipated, and there is this backlash. I would say that this reaction to this emancipation, where they think that the only way to save their pride as a man is to reinforce their control over women. Is that kind of answer you're looking for?
No, I want the answer that you think is correct, and but I wanted to know. I just specifically am interested in your thoughts on it, because there's so much tribalism even in the discourse now, right? You've got I don't know what it is. I think it's just the social justice warriors on one side. Then you have the status quo warriors. That's at least what I've been hearing about it. Like, people want to maintain the status quo, and so there's a lot of, and I feel like that they're also very polarized. I think they miss a lot of the. I mean, I find a lot of things on both sides that make a lot of sense. I think that many of the things that these quote social justice warriors say, they resonate with me. They make sense to me. And they are the reason that I left Islam. The reason I rejected religion overall was because of these ideals of feminism, because of these ideals of, like, people having gay rights. It was because I was against nationalism. I was against, like, all of this tribalism and this idea that we're all bonded by some kind of language or skin color or some sort of history, even some kind of religious history. Like, I rejected these ideas, and these are the ideas that are so pervasive in religion, especially the Islamic religion, and I mean in other Abrahamic religions as well, broadly, that those are the things I rejected. So I find it very confusing sometimes, when I'm looking at the discourse and I'm seeing people who came from a background like myself very few of them, fortunately, very few but very vocal, right? I mean, the majority of people who come from my background who left Islam are still overwhelmingly sort of liberal and left-leaning. But many of them kind of going on and just accepting the very same ideas that they rejected Islam for, but they're accepting them under a different premise, you know. With this, so it's that's why I think this conversation is important, where we can kind of, you know, parse some of these issues and
Yes.
really talk about the issue itself rather than what tribe you belong to and who has the right thing. And again, but the same thing, I think a lot of the stuff the social justice people say are absolutely ridiculous. Like their apologetics for Islam and their apologetics for a lot of the horrible things that are in the religion. I mean, they will very easily pounce on the same kind of misogyny and homophobia in Christianity, but when it comes to Islam, you know, they'll just try to pretend, oh, you know, they're an oppressed minority. It's okay what they do, which is a form of bigotry. It's a bigotry of low expectations, right?
Can we talk a bit more that, or would you like to proceed to a new topic?
I would, yeah. No, go ahead.
Because I recently read a bit about that in literature, also because I read some of the writings of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, which is that part of the left, which you might call the regressive left, or some of the social justice warriors, their thinking is collectivist. So they're thinking in terms of groups, and some groups are oppressors and some groups are oppressed, oppressed. And there can't be any differences within a group. A group should be treated as a group and not as individuals. And the problem with that is that a lot of minorities within the minorities are then oppressed by the majority within the minority.
Yeah. Isn't that a kind of, when you do that sort of collectivism, and this is another problem, like this whole thing about whether we should be collectivists or look at the individual. Of course, you have to have both. I mean, you wouldn't have a lot of the great strides we've made in feminism and civil rights and everything if there wasn't some sort of collectivist dynamic happening. But at the same time, if you're saying that, okay, everybody in a group should be thinking the same way, that is bigotry. That's racist. And that's, if you say that if you're black, then, or if you're a person of color, you know, as they say, which is another sort of loaded term, you know, everybody should be thinking the same way. I mean, you know, you can't. I mean, and if you don't think the same way, if you don't toe the line, then, you know, you're somehow not a person of color. You're not part of that group. That doesn't make any sense. That in itself is racial stereotyping. It is racial stereotyping that, you know, you want to assume that if this guy is a Muslim, then he's going to have a certain set of ideas. And God forbid, if he says something that strays from it, well, then he's not part of the narrative. He's not a Muslim. He's, you know, he's excommunicated. Takfir. Like what you know, in the Muslim world, they call it takfir. They excommunicate you from Islam, and then you're punishable with all these like horrible consequences. So and you need that. So you do need the collectivist dynamic in order to make strides for oppressed groups. Oppressed groups are real, marginalized groups are real. I mean, these things happen. You know, there were black people were they were enslaved for, you know, several centuries, 400 plus years. Muslims are being targeted in the West, in the US, by the Trumpian far right, right? There are the Jews. There's a lot of anti-Semitism that still exists now in the UK, right? And it's coming in not only from the traditional far right, but also in a more insidious form from leftists too, right? There's and so these things are complicated. They're happening, and when you want to deal with these issues, you have to look at it through a collective lens, but that you disregard the views of individuals who think differently, or you assume that everybody who's part of this is going to think the same way.
I think a good way to think about this is to think that everyone is a member of multiple groups, or you have a pluralistic identity, as Guy Verhofstadt says.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many things all at the same time. So
Yeah.
I'm a man, I'm white, but I'm an atheist. I'm Dutch, I'm European, but I'm also a vegetarian. There are many labels you can assume, and none of them should like you may have a primary label, but it's not like that one label must necessarily exclude another if they don't address the same topic. For example, atheism and vegetarianism. You don't have to be a vegetarian to be an atheist or otherwise. It's just different domains, and it's possible to be both. I see a lot of intersection between lots of these groups, and it must be recognized that any group can have members of another group, even if they don't really address the same issue. Or so, and what happens in collectivist thinking is that they don't recognize that people can be members of multiple groups.
Right.
They essentialize someone to just one label, Muslim, for example, or white, or gay, or whatever. So, and that is the problem. When you generalize about people and you paint them with one broad brush, for example, this is a group who are bad, who need to be removed, need to be attacked, or this is an oppressed group, we need to defend all of them in every instance, in every case. That is when a lot of violence will happen, a lot of oppression will happen, either because you cause it or either because you let it happen. And that's what we need to fight. That's what we need to prevent.
And I think that, when you're talking about having multiple identities and everything, it makes me think of intersectionality, which is also a loaded term. And
yes, I mentioned it.
yeah, which is actually, yeah, you did. So what's funny about that? Even though intersectionality within feminist discourse is it's usually used to talk about oppression. I'm a member of multiple groups and I'm oppressed in multiple ways, or things like that. What's interesting to me about it is that a lot of the people who think in collectivist terms really embrace the term intersectionality, when intersectionality really does highlight the attributes of the individual. So there's a contradiction there too.
Yes, that's true.
There's a confusion, which is, if you really talk about intersectionality, it's the whole, like, for instance, if I say that, okay, yes, I'm part of a Muslim background, I am Pakistani, I have brown skin, but I am also, I am also a scientist, and I'm also a physician who embraces, scientific inquiry over faith and reason. And I also am Canadian, which means, which doesn't necessarily mean this, but in my case, I embrace Enlightenment values, right, over that are pretty much what runs Canadian society, over a lot of the Islamic values. So if I have that is very pro-individual. I mean, that is my individual thing, and it's caused by an intersection of all of these things. So that is a kind of intersectionality, but it's the kind of thing that a lot of the sort of the way that many other of my fellow leftists think about intersectionality, it contradicts it. It's something that would make them probably uncomfortable. I'm from the Muslim world, but I think Islam is bullshit. For instance, like if I say that's something that would probably trigger a lot of them. But that's why I think that the discourse, I feel, is so confused with all of these little terms, and these terms make sense, but when you actually illustrate an aspect of the term that doesn't fit with their narrative, but it also fits with the term, then it freaks out a lot of people. It's fun too, right? But so I wanted to ask one thing that we discussed. We're talking about all these shootings and all these killings and the terrorist attacks, the white supremacist terrorist attacks, the Islamic terrorist attacks, all of this stuff. There've also been a few of these, just a handful, not too many, of the far left people like the Dayton, Ohio shooter, which happened a day after the El Paso shooting in the U.S., was an Elizabeth Warren supporter, was a Bernie supporter. He was like a far left kind of guy. And he didn't leave a manifesto, though, and he didn't really provide any kind of ideological basis for it. He also killed his sister in the attack. So that's leading to, it's leading a lot of people to think that maybe there was something else that was there that is not necessarily ideologically based. And they're talking about it. But we did see, the shooting of Steve Scalise. He was another, this is also an American thing. He's a U.S. congressman who was shot again by sort of a far left Bernie supporter type guy. Obviously, Bernie doesn't support this. They all disavow it. And so does Elizabeth Warren. They've never said this kind of thing. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the far left, some of the far left radicalization? Is it in the same category, or do you feel like it parallels it? How do we handle that? Or think about it?
Well, I think it's distinct in a way, but it has parallels as well. So you don't resort to violence unless you feel you really have to, I think. I don't think there's a sense of entitlement. There's probably an idea of needing to rise in the defense of someone who is oppressed. That's usually what drives the far left. So they usually don't do it for themselves. They usually don't do it because they themselves have been denied something or they themselves are oppressed. It's usually for some group of people that they consider victims and that they need to defend. So you see this a lot with animal activism. So they tend to usually they don't really attack people, but they destroy a lot of property that can be used, for example, to slaughter animals or to keep animals. But this is not activism about those activists themselves, because they are not the victims. The same would be about the murderer of Pim Fortuyn, who was also incidentally an animal rights activist, but in this case he wanted to defend immigrants, minorities, including Muslims. And Pim Fortuyn at the time was really stepping up his rhetoric against Islam, and he said he wanted an immigration ban, but he said, I probably can't fix an immigration ban. If I could, I would. And he was saying that Islam is a backward religion and things like that. And this is the reason why this far leftist terrorist killed him. So it was not because he himself was oppressed or had been denied something that he felt that he was entitled to, but he was doing it for others. So I think then, and this is pretty common in far leftist circles, they probably do it because they think that someone else is being oppressed or being denied something.
Yeah. Do you think that makes it? Is there, so aside from that, is there a distinction? Because there is a lot of the stuff that, okay, there's the rise of white nationalism, white supremacism, and all this white supremacist terrorism. And then, the Dayton, Ohio shooting happens. And obviously, there are many people on the right who will say, well, why are you ignoring this? You had the whole whites where you're always talking about white supremacy causes terrorism. You had these two shootings one day after another. And one guy was clearly a far leftist. And why aren't you bringing that ideology as a motive? And the response to that is because there's no evidence that ideology was necessarily a motive. Whereas the other guy, the far right guy, left a manifesto, and et cetera, et cetera. I did kind of see these things before with, whenever we talk about Islamic terrorism, the same sort of leftist types who don't want to talk about the Dayton, Ohio shooting would say, well, what about all the Christian suicide bombers? What about the Christian, not suicide bombers, the Christian bombers of abortion clinics?
Yes, exactly. They always go to abortion clinic.
They always go to that.
Terrorism. Yes.
And the truth is that, yes, abortion clinic bombings are a they're a trademark of a lot of this Christian fundamentalism, but they're still an aberration when you look at the overall worldwide trend of religious terrorism. It is
Yes.
at this point in time, right now, it is overwhelmingly Islamic terrorism, and we're not talking about the U.S. or the Western world. We're talking about around the world, the places where I grew up. That is the main thing, and I feel it's a similar thing. Yes, the left has been associated with terrorism. It has happened in the 60s. It's always been wrong. And today you have issues like Antifa is the worst thing I think that could happen. I mean, Noam Chomsky himself called it a gift to the right. He said Antifa is a gift to the right because they'll call themselves anti-fascists, but just a couple of years ago at the Pride Parade in Toronto, right, a bunch of these Antifa guys surrounded LGBT ex-Muslims. These are LGBT people who were persecuted, who escaped persecution in their own Muslim majority countries to come here and march at Pride Parade and talk against homophobia in Islam. And they surrounded them and they said, no, you're being Islamophobic by doing this. So stop. Which to me sounds fascistic. It doesn't even sound like it's anti-fascistic. So you have these elements come around, but I still feel like they are. I feel like the white supremacist far right authoritarian terrorism. I mean, Antifa does not have a president in the White House that aligns with their views, right? These people who are shutting down speakers at college campuses, which I also think is a terrible thing to do. I don't like it at all, and I've spoken out against it. They don't have people who are running the country and who have a majority in Congress, who have people who align with their views in an actual legislative body, in the Supreme Court, in the White House. And I think that right now is the key difference. It's not just about numbers, but it's also about the level of power that they have and the proportion of power that they have. But what are your thoughts on that? Just the far left, because Armin and I talk about this a lot. And like, what's worse, the far left or the far right? I mean, it's kind of a fun conversation to have, even though I don't know how fruitful it is, because I mean, but I guess that is the simpler version of the question I'm trying to ask. What do you think poses a bigger threat right now?
Well, I think it really depends on where in the world you're talking about. Obviously, in the United States at the moment, the far left is not as dangerous as the far right, not as dangerous as jihadism. But it will be different in other countries. For example, in Latin America, there is far more support for communism and socialism. Some governments have been or are still socialist over there. We can talk about Venezuela, for example, or Cuba. Very clear examples. Bolivia also tries or has tried socialism, I think under Morales. So over there, it's also very common to have communist leftist guerrillas, but this is not common in the United States, not common in Canada, and you won't find it in the Middle East. I've yet to see a communist guerrilla in the Middle East so far, actually. So I should also say that, for example, in the Netherlands, a recent report from security services, the AIVD, I think that's a few months ago, they published a report in which they say that in general in the Netherlands, the far left is more dangerous than the far right. In my country, the far left will more easily resort to violence and aggressive actions than the far right does. Not exactly terrorist attacks. That's very rare nowadays. There used to be a few in the 70s and 80s from communists. But for example, they will use fireworks and throw stones, and at far right protesters, for example, they will often not obey police orders and try to intervene at the far right march, for example. And the far right generally obeys police orders when it comes to this kind of thing. So in general, Dutch intelligence services generally think that in the Netherlands the far leftists are a bit more dangerous than the far right at the moment.
That's really interesting. One thing that I try to tell, and I for all of the ex-Muslims who are hearing this, I think it's really important for us to, because when we talk about the regressive left, which I know you've talked about, I know I've written about a lot, and it's a pet peeve of a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
I think we really need to drive home the point that Islamic, Islam in general is a far right ideology. I mean, it is.
Yes.
Islam, just like white supremacy, Islamic supremacy, these are far right ideologies. And when we talk about these people who espouse all of this stuff, we should refer to them as far right Islamic ideologues. I think if you have a label like that and you get that out into the system, you drive that point home that these are far right people. Like the far right in the U.S., like the way that Trump thinks about women, the way that a lot of the current Trumpian Republicans think about, whether it's women, whether it's about racial supremacy or supremacy for a certain number of people or a certain group of people. The way that they think about foreigners and all of the xenophobia, the way they think about gay people, all of these are completely aligned with the Islamic theocracies I grew up in. I mean, it's the only difference is that for them, the Islamic theocracy they live under, that's basically like Trump on steroids without any checks and balances. I mean, that's what it's like. That's the horror that they're living, and I don't feel that enough leftists understand that these are similar things, and they are driven right now. Their activism and their drive right now, this recent intensity of jihadism, this recent intensity of the far right authoritarian populism, is driven by this idea that there was a world that was good for us in the past. We want to go back to it. We want to make it great again. The world, the way that it used to be. We want to. I mean, it's Islamic. In the Islamic world, people want to do that too. All these guys, like, we want to make it like it was when our women were modest. When we could protect them, they had status in society because they were protected by men, and they needed that protection. All of that stuff that they say, you hear the same kind of thing from your Stefan Molyneux type people.
Yes.
And it's so important, I think, to drive home the point and just call all of them far right, because that is what they are.
Yes. Maybe I should also start doing that more than I have done so far. We generally distinguish them. We generally reserve the far right for native-born Westerners who may or may not identify with Christianity, but that's maybe also a bit more complicated, because some of these white nationalists are not Christian. They may in fact be atheists, or they may be confused. Some of them may actually have sympathy for Nordic or Germanic mythology. So we've seen it, for example, with the Christchurch shooter. His manifesto blends Christianity in with Nordic mythology. He says, "I'll pray to God, but I seal you in Valhalla." Valhalla? Well, that's not Christian. That's Nordic paganism. That's the Germanic mythology. So what's happening there? And we see the same with Anders Breivik, the one who shot in Utøya and bombed Oslo. He also had a mix of Christianity and Odinism, which is a form of Germanic neo-paganism. So he believes in the Norwegian, the Germanic gods, and Odin in particular. So he worships Odin. So that's really strange. So
It's
so
it's intersectionality is making its way into white supremacist terrorism. There you go. That's your headline. Yeah, it's
yes,
amazing.
so that's interesting how you phrase that. Yes. So
Yeah,
in that sense, ideologically, uh, the Western far right is more diverse, and it tries to unify lots of the contradictory things. Um, and so you have Odinists and Germanic neo-pagans against Christians, against atheists. Um, some are like linguistic purists, so they don't want any other language, and others embrace English as the unifying language of the alt-right. So it's really complicated. You have the same people who denounce English as a foreign intrusion, who use who will share videos from Russia Today, for example, to embolden their argument against immigration, for example. So this is really a really contradictory set of movements. It may not even be a unified movement. White nationalism, white supremacism, um, Christian identity politics, Christian fundamentalism, Odinism. Not all Odinists are far right, by the way. Should also emphasize
yeah,
that. But like it's a really mixed bag of loosely related ideas, but there are very different amongst them. So, and maybe that's the reason why we don't have a very good term for it. We generally call it far right, but we reserve far right for this Western set of ideologies, and we usually don't apply the term far right to Islamism and jihadism. Maybe we should, because ideologically they are more closely related than
yeah. I
than that actually they're different.
yeah,
They just follow a different holy book, even though the Western far right not necessarily Christian,
right. Yeah, I
but
think that's something we should talk about. And for all of you guys, for everyone who's listening to this, especially people who are ex-Muslims, let us know what you think. Like, just write in. You can email us at secularjihadists@gmail.com, or you can go to our Facebook page, leave a comment. Let us know what you think about this, because I'm very interested right now in messaging, um, and especially messaging in a way it's very easy to get sort of likes and retweets. I just have to write all the stuff Imam Tawhidi does, but then I'm speaking to an echo chamber. But the people I want to reach, the kind of people that I grew up with who think like me, that the liberals and the left, I don't want to just make a gotcha argument and make a point. I want to see if I can make a change. And so I think about messaging a lot. And I remember when I was in, Amsterdam and Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, one of the things I talked about was how, what kind of messages would hit home with liberals. So if I draw analogs, if I say something like, for instance, when white people in Europe, or when white Christian Europe rose up against their religious theocracies, we called it the Enlightenment. Now, when brown Muslims are using their language, when brown Muslims are doing it in their part of the world, you're calling it Islamophobia and you're calling it selling out. So isn't that a double standard? And I was amazed at how much that resonated with the liberals. I had so many people come up to me and say that, wow, okay, I never thought about it that way before, that there is a double standard. Then there's a whole question, well, how do we go about this without looking like bigots? And that's a whole different conversation. But at least it's a start. And I feel that I want to make it more comfortable for liberal, left-leaning people who are not Muslim, or generally people who are white, to be able to speak up about this. How can we do that? Well, what are they comfortable speaking up about? They're comfortable speaking up about far-right ideology. They're comfortable speaking up about tribal supremacy, whether it's white supremacy, Islamic supremacy, or whatever it is. They like criticizing those things. And how can we? And if we're saying that the Islamic world, what they're doing is no different than all the stuff that you're opposing here. In fact, it's worse because it's unchecked, and they don't have a prominent liberal left that is organized or can speak without threat of being killed or persecuted, who can counter the stuff like you have here.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think even more importantly, generally Middle Eastern states don't have rule of law. They don't have democracy. They don't have a separation of church and state. They don't have all these checks and balances that a good functioning liberal democracy in the West does usually. So, and this is why here we are able to tackle these issues much better than in the Middle East.
And we are gonna see a little bit more of this before it actually dies down. Ultimately, the world is changing. There's nothing they can really do to stop it. They're just trying really hard to hold it back. I mean, this is happening in the Islamic world. Here in the U.S., I mean, just to give you some stats, since 2013, the majority of babies in the United States that have been born since 2013 are non-white. Okay, what is the most common average age for whites in the U.S.? 58. The most common age for Asians, blacks, Hispanics, especially for Hispanics, is 11. It's younger and younger and younger. Okay, then the death rate among white people, right? The death rates actually outnumber the births. So white deaths outnumber white births in 26 states as of 2016. In 2004, there were only 4 states where there were more white people dying than living. So than being born. So in 2004 to 20, in just 12 years, it's gone from 4 states to 26 states where there are more white people dying than being born. All of these dynamics together, I get for a lot of people. I mean, even if they're not, I get this. Even if you're not white supremacists, even if you're not white nationalists, if you've been raised in a certain way, if there has been certain, these levels of indoctrination, that can feel unsettling. But as you said, it's not something that you need to be scared about, right? No. But there are people who have these concerns and they want to understand them and they want to find a way to voice them. And if they do voice them, we can have a conversation like we're having right now, and talk about it. But these are realities that are coming up. When they're talking about. I don't think the white race is going to be extinct anytime soon. But things are things are changing in a pretty dramatic way with all of this stuff. So I kind of feel like we're going to see more. Listen, Leon, I have one last question for you because I think we're coming up to the end of our time now. When you were in this whole thing, the white nationalism, you were part of the neo-Nazi group and all that. Yeah. There's obviously very sort of widespread denunciation of this, in every newspaper article, in the media, later social media also, that, from severe criticism to mockery of white supremacists and Nazis and everything like that.
Oh yeah.
Now, how did you view that? So here's the thing. There's a bit of a multiple choice question.
Yeah, sure.
Did you look at it and say, okay, well, I'm seeing all of this, fuck this stuff, this makes me even more resolute in what I think because everybody's trying to victimize me? Or did you think, oh my God, I am an outcast and these people are all making fun of me. I don't want to feel stupid. Maybe I want to be out of this so I can just be a normal person and fit in the real world, or was it a combination of the two, or what is it? Do both approaches work? Do they not? How do you get through? I guess that's the question.
Yes, it was definitely a combination between the two, and I tried to explain that earlier in this interview. That between the emotional doubling down, like if you try to treat me as an outcast, I will double down. I know that I'm right, and I will show you I will convince all of you, and I'll make myself heard. And on the other hand, yes, I do want to be accepted by society. I do not want to be an outcast. I do want to be friends with everyone. After all, like I am trying to do my best for this country, for this people. And why are you rejecting me? Like the very people that I say that I am advocating for are actually turning against me. So
Oh yeah.
it's really strange. It's also caused a bit of cognitive dissonance in my mind, because I wouldn't really accept members of my nation if they were too left wing. So even though I was saying like I love you, I love my people, but not if you're left wing. What's that? What's
Your
that?
people don't. Yeah, that's so I never thought about it like that before. Like the idea that you're saying, yeah, I'm doing this for the white people, I'm doing this for the white people, but you're like this fringe minority group, and most of the white people are like, what the fuck are you doing?
Yes. Yes.
And like, hey, I'm doing this for you, but you're not like, yeah, we don't want you to do this for me.
Oh,
That's
exactly.
interesting. So even from a point of like trying to fit in and being part of, you said you didn't have friends and you were looking for a group to fit into. That pull is probably still there, and when you're outcast even further as part of a group, it's we just have this thing that with a lot of times with when we talk in among our Muslim community, and we have the same kind of conversations, and we criticize Islam sometimes. We mock it and everything. There's a lot of people who react very, very angrily, and they get upset. And there's a whole chorus of people that come. They say, you shouldn't do this. You're not going to get through by satirizing and mocking these people. But very often, that's their initial reaction, the emotional doubling down you're talking about. But that emotional doubling down isolates them even further, and then later on they come out and they say, okay. Very often they'll come out and they'll be like, I used to think this way. I had a fight with you a couple of years ago, but now I want to talk to you. So it's strange. It doesn't sort of jive with what's intuitive to us in terms of the kind of things that would work, but it does work. I've seen it a lot of times.
Yes, so there's various push and pull factors in there. So it may also be that you don't feel safe within the white nationalist movement. So people are, at least in my experience, but anecdotally from others as well, it's quite a violent environment. So if you don't conform to their standards, if you associate too much with foreigners, or if you don't accept certain ideas, then, or you don't show certain behavior, masculine behavior, for example, then they may threaten you, or you may get into fights. I've had two fights with other nationalists about certain disagreements, because I felt they didn't respect me or didn't accept me or whatever. But all this time I've never had a fight with a foreigner, but I have had fights with other nationalists. What's that about? Like, there are, and also some people want to leave because they are actually fearing for their lives, because they don't want to conform to certain ideas or certain behavior within the movement, but they're afraid that if they do try to leave the community, then they will be treated as traitors and there will be revenge against them. And that's what keeps a lot of people in the movement, because they fear that there will be reprisals if they leave. And I also had that fear, but fortunately I was never that involved, so it was relatively easy for me to leave. I slowly stopped contacting these people, slowly watered down my involvement in the movement, and that's how I gradually finished it. Let's gradually just turn the page. But yeah, for others it's not easy, especially, for example, if they have a relationship within the community with a woman, or they are a woman, so the relationship with a man, and she wants to leave, but they have kids together, and who gets to have the kids? So the man wants to keep the kids. So how do you leave such a community when your ties are very intimate? For example, you may have financial ties with other members of the community. It's very difficult to leave then. Sometimes you're forced to double down because of social economic factors,
Yeah.
but also it's because it's a very unsafe and unhealthy environment, and the rest of society rejects you, but some of the rest of society try to pull you out sometimes.
Yeah.
So it goes both ways, and I think maybe reason or various circumstances. There's no single thing I can point to which eventually led me to leave. I think my own reason, uh, my own rational thinking process was most important. That I felt like, okay, I don't want to become a Nazi and never identified as a Nazi. I know this is wrong, and if I don't need them and if I have other friends to turn to, I want to leave. And I still think that nationalism is a good thing, but at least I want to be moderate about it. And I'll try to change my views and listen to people who think differently, who are more left wing than I am. So yes,
It's kind
so
of
I'm a
incremental.
fortunate case, but there are probably many people within the white nationalist supremacist movement who can't leave but would like to,
Yeah.
and that's very hard for them. So there are various organizations for them. For example, Hope After Hate. I've talked to the co-founder of that. Tony McClear is his name, by the way.
Yeah.
Hope After Hate is a very good organization for people who want to leave behind their far right movement, but
Yeah.
have difficulty doing it, or they have already left, but they still have traumas to process, or things to settle. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
we'll actually in the description to this, if you get online, we'll put the link for Hope After Hate as well, so you can see that. We're also going to put a link to your Twitter so people can follow you, and your Facebook and your social media. Can you just what's your Twitter handle? Can you just say if
Leon
people want to
Kort.
follow?
So
Leon Kort. So
Leon Kort. So
okay,
yes.
so we're going to do that. Leon, I'm going to be meeting Leon again. I'll be meeting you again at the end of this month at the conference in what's it called again? I keep forgetting the name of
Celebrating
the
Dissent Festival.
Celebrating Dissent Festival in Amsterdam from August 31st and September 1st. That's when it's taking place. So I'm going to be there. Leon's going to be there. Armin Vabi's going to be there. Zainab Al-Razoui, the former Charlie Hebdo, she used to work there. She's going to be there. Mariam Namazi, Sarah Haider, Mohammed Sayed, you name it. Like that, everybody is going to be at that conference. It's going to be massive. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I really can't wait to
Yes,
see you
I'm
there, man.
so enthusiastic about it, to meet all these people. Many of them for the first time. For example, Rana Ahmad, who escaped
Escaped
Saudi
Saudi Arabia.
Arabia.
Yeah, she
Is
left Saudi Arabia. She escaped that, and she's the one who took the picture of the Atheist Republic thing
yes,
at
exactly.
at the Kaaba. She was in
Yes.
Mecca, and she took
Yes.
that picture. So it was there's this. It's going to be just an amazing meeting. So I really can't wait for it. And I'll come. I'll bring my guitar and stuff, and we're gonna have a lot of fun. So I think it's gonna be great. And hey, Leon, thank you for coming up. I think
You're
this
welcome.
was a very wide-ranging conversation. I think we got into a lot of depth about a lot of things. So I'm just very interested in trying to understand how this is happening, and I hope you do more sort of public speaking on this. And you know, there's many times in this conversation you said that you were ashamed of the way you thought, and I get why you're acknowledging that, but I think that what you're doing right now and talking about it and illustrating, especially somebody who's because people who go through this stuff, a lot of times they try to explain what they went through, and it's in very simplistic terms. But I feel like you have a much more intelligent analysis of how you think. There's a lot of consistency. You don't deny the same kind of things. You don't want to be politically correct, because a lot of people who do this, there are other former white supremacists and people in the KKK who do this, and they come out, but they are inconsistent. They don't look at, for example, Islamic supremacy as something. They don't look at the parallels. They don't see that there are similar things and dynamics happening there. And if you don't, I think you lose. If you want to stop this and you don't identify those common denominators, you lose the battle already before you've even begun it. So I just think your insights are super crystal clear on this, and I am pretty confident that most of the people who are listening to this right now are going to agree with it. So I really, really appreciate it. Anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, not at the time. I think we've discussed everything that was on our minds, at least for now.
Okay.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Oh no, thank you for coming on. It's our honor. And for everybody else, you can have more conversations like this. You can listen to them if you go to secularjihadist.com. Also, if you're interested in supporting this, if you like what you hear and you want to hear more stuff like this, and you want to make it possible for us to do this and translate it into different languages, consider becoming a supporter. Go to patreon.com/sjme, and over there, for as little as $1 a month, you can support the podcast financially. If you don't want to do that, that's perfectly fine. Share it on your social media timelines, tell people about it, and importantly, go to iTunes and leave us a review. If you go to iTunes, leave us a review, that helps us become more prominent. It helps more people become aware that we're having these conversations, and more people will listen to them. So thank you, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
The secular jihadists have been made possible thanks to the Illuminati and the covert support of Israel and the CIA. That's what we have been told, but we haven't received our checks yet. If you like what we do, please support us. Share the podcast with your friends. Write and tweet us with topic and guest suggestions. Or head over to secularjihadist.com and give $1 or more for exclusive access to live video. Have your questions read and answered on the air, and more. Till next time, may the flying spaghetti monster be with you.